Eric, can you hear us?
All right, so just to run through the day here, per our discussion last night, what we'll do is we'll talk about readiness for a bit here. We'll talk a bit about change management within readiness, and then we're going to shift gears, talk about data readiness and data migration in general, which dovetails well from the implementation readiness piece of it. And then Marcus will talk about lessons from failures and lawsuits. And then what I thought we'd do is, if you guys are good with it, is if you want to do more of a deep dive into change management, we can with whatever time's left. And certainly afterwards, if we want to have more informal discussions or whatever, we can do that. But we'll plan on going until noon. But are you guys good with that? Does anyone object, or does anyone feel like, hey, change management's super important, or we want to make sure we spend more time on that, knowing that we will cover part of that in implementation readiness? So
sounds good to me. Thank you.
But I think you're going to cover it.
Yeah. Yeah, at least for the readiness piece of it, and we'll touch on, and I've got a few, what I could do too, even if we have 15 minutes, we could spend 15 minutes talking through some general change management concepts and frameworks that'll at least set the tone beyond implementation readiness. So we'll cover it in a little bit more depth for the implementation readiness phase, and then we can talk more of the downstream stuff later on as well. Sound good? All right, good. So what we'll cover in this session is why readiness is so important, and provide an overview of implementation readiness framework, and then dive into the individual components. There's five different work streams that we typically dive into when we're talking about readiness, and work streams that we think about. And then there's a section at the end about just a QA framework that we typically use to help keep a project on track and to help identify and mitigate risks throughout a project. And it's the same framework we use whenever we go in for a project recovery. So if someone says, hey, our project is struggling or has failed or whatever, come in and help us figure out what's going wrong and how we can get back on track. We use that same framework for that. And then when we're doing for work with people like Marcus, when we're doing expert witness work, we use that same framework to analyze lawsuits and failures and stuff like that. So it's a kind of a battle-tested framework that has, unfortunately for some, but it's been battle-tested in pretty extreme situations in these failures, and we try to bring that forward in the process to use that same discipline to identify and mitigate risk throughout implementation. So we'll talk just a few minutes about that at the end too. So just to set the context, one of the challenges we see with companies is that they, I'm going to try and get rid of that thing at the top. Sorry. We may just have to live with that there. One of the things that we typically will advise clients on is that one of the challenges of jumping straight into an implementation once you've selected the software is that a lot of times you're not ready. I mean, there's a lot of decisions that still need to be made, and there's a lot of internal competency and buy-in and alignment and support that needs to be built first. And there's an interesting dynamic that we see a lot of times with clients, because there's so much excitement around whatever the product is that's being selected and implemented, that there's this feeling or this perceived need just to start doing stuff. We got to get going. We got to get the system integrator. Let's start building stuff and testing it. And it may feel like you're saving time or you're moving along, but what it ends up happening is you get stuck in the mud pretty quickly because you don't have the clear direction. The system integrator, oftentimes there's an interesting dynamic that isn't very healthy, where because you're not ready, you don't have the right team in place or the right vision for the project, the system integrator ends up taking a lot more control than they probably should. And it's not that they're trying to, it's just in the absence of anything else, they're going to take control of the project and start doing stuff with the technology. Now, probably the biggest thing, when you go back and look at why a project goes over budget and how these big failures happen, like the ones Marcus has talked about, is a lot of times it's not just poor project governance or no one was paying attention to the budget or no one was paying attention to the timeline. That's usually not really the issue. What the real issue is the third box on the top from the left. The consultants show up and you've got however many people are going to be working on this project, and they start billing by the hour. And meanwhile, you're trying to figure out, well, wait, how do we want our processes to look, or what are we trying to do here? And so you end up wasting a lot of time and money, when the system integrator has their staff there, whether you're ready or not. So that's the other reason we kind of say, get that implementation readiness ready first, and then strategically engage the system integrator and make sure you're controlling that versus the other way around. The other dynamic is in the absence of having a clear blueprint or vision, and I hate to use the word blueprint too interchangeably because that is an SAP term, and I know yesterday, was it you that said, or who was it that said something about blueprint and they don't want to? Greenfield.
Yeah.
Someone was saying not being ready or not wanting to talk about blueprint yet. But the idea there is that you don't want the technology to drive the business too much. I mean, obviously there's certain functionality that is going to enable your processes and is going to influence very heavily your business processes. But at the end of the day, you have to think of it as what do we do as a business? I mean, forget S/4HANA for a minute. Just what do we do as a business, and how does that translate into what we need SAP to do and the requirements we have and the processes we want it to support? So, you ended up when we don't have that, in the absence of that, we're just going to defer to the technology, and the technology is going to dictate the processes for us, or worse yet, when the technology has multiple options, the system integrator will decide for you how that process should look, just because, in the absence of information, they're going to fill that void. Too much time and money, I mentioned. The project team, employees, executives tend to get frustrated then, when you start to jump straight in or cliff dive into the project. It's too much for your business to absorb, and then you have that lack of internal ownership and buy-in. So those are some of the risks of not doing readiness, and if you look at these risks and look at what happens as a result of just jumping straight into the implementation without having done readiness, these things become the impetus for a lot of other downstream risks and challenges and problems that happen later on. So if we can just nip it in the bud and mitigate these risks up front by doing the implementation readiness phase, that helps tremendously. So this kind of reinforces the same concept here, but you take the S/4HANA, you're ready to roll, but the common challenge is we don't want to rush into it. We don't want to delegate the entire thing. We also, two system integrators, and we also don't want to just jump straight in with the system integrator without addressing the things that they don't do. And the good thing with the big system integrators is that they have scale and they have access to a lot of resources, but that doesn't mean they're good at, or they have the competencies around some of the key things that are going to make the project successful. So we have to identify what are they not good at, how are we going to plug those gaps, and then how are we going to manage that overall program, then bring in the system integrator to play the role that they need to play in the project. And then also it sets unrealistic expectations when we just jump straight in and people feel like, all right, the clock's ticking, today's day one, we need to start moving things along quickly.
Eric, on the addressing their deficiencies, have you found that most are pretty self-aware? If you organizationally self-aware, like this is a weakness of ours and we're going to have to plug that gap other ways, or will they come forward by and large and say we can take care of all your needs?
Usually the latter. I don't know what were you about to say something?
Yeah, well, I think that some parts of the organization are aware of what's wrong with the other parts of the organization, but they don't always own up to it at the same time in order to be able to address it in a healthy and effective way.
Yeah.
Rarely, it's great when you get them to come in and they say, we kind of understand this about ourselves, but usually maybe that's after a lot of fighting behind doors and stuff. But most of the time they're kind of in denial and split in the blame game already at that point.
And they're so big too that a lot of times you're dealing with the SAP group, and they'll have, for example, like some change management competencies around training, general communications and stuff. But usually if there is a competency that they have, which they do have, it's usually the real more strategic change management, for example. That's usually a different group that isn't necessarily, that's not in the domain of who's working on your project. So, and that's the problem with the bigger guys is they're so massive that they don't talk to one another, like Darryl was saying. The smaller ones, I think the small and mid-sized ones, I feel like the small and mid-sized ones are a little bit more self-aware. They kind of know, like, hey, we do this, and you need someone over here to do that or this. But I think the big guys, and you would assume that if you're dealing with one of those big system integrators, they've got hundreds of thousands of employees, you just assume, like, I'm sure they can handle it, right? But the reality is, yeah, they've got all those employees, but that doesn't mean that that's their focus for your project. So that's kind of a tricky balance with them.
Yeah, that's a key point. I think working with the big, any big consulting firms, they have done this for many years. A lot of consultants, you expect them to come in and give you, or maybe make it better for you in terms of solving your problem. But their approach is very cookie cutter, and they come with a box. SAP, and they have their own box. So they try to fit you into that, and they don't truly understand your business, your challenges. They don't spend time in understanding it. Like, oh, we have done this. we know we can fix this for you, but every organization is different. People are different, the culture is different.
Mhm.
They don't factor that in.
Totally agree with you. I mean, I've just seen so many companies and their projects destroyed by large consulting organizations. And it's disheartening. And it's not that the people that come in and are leading the project and sitting there aren't good at what they do. It's just that these are massive project teams. There are massive amounts of people. They have incentivized bonus programs to garner more business within existing clients. So I found that they're continually selling, and I've seen pretty evil elbowing folks out of the way in an attempt to get more market share, get more staff on, get more control over different elements of the project. So you really want to be careful. I think one of the best things that a company can do is to make sure, and I'm not doing this in a self-serving way, it's because I don't work for Accenture and I don't work for these guys, so I can't stand the model. Seed into your teams some independent folks, because they're going to keep the Accenture people honest. But then make sure that you listen to them, because the Accenture and Deloittes of the world, and even the HCLs and the Cognizants, although not so much on the Cognizant side that I've seen, but they will do coordinated attacks to force out independent consultants because they can't control them. And you have to really make sure that you're listening, putting those people in and listening to what they're saying, because they don't get extra money. They're not going to bring armies of people in. They're just there to do their job. And that's just you've probably seen a tip of that. And it's getting worse. It's really getting worse.
Can I just share my observation as well, if we have time? So when we embark on a project, typically larger scale projects, the first thought is, okay, let's go to the market and talk to the first tier, the SIs. The fact is, it's yes, as an SI, they have fantastic credentials, like 40,000 people, 100,000 people, etc. They have done this similar one at a similar industry. The question I would ask is, the person who did this project, is he available to come and do it our pace? You know,
you gotta push to get your
not
18.
the company, but that individual and the team. Am I getting that?
Yep.
If the answer is no, then we are just signing up for your branding.
And the truth is, they're hiring a lot of consultants anyway.
Yes.
If you call Accenture and then Deloitte and you ask for a team and whatever, they'll call me. They call me.
Fantastic.
They try to hire me for it. I mean, you're not getting special people. They're going into the same market pool. But once you're in, they control, what you say and do, and you're under that group. And you're going to get C players and you get young grads and things like that really don't know. But you can, and I know one of the clients that we work with did a really good job. They just held out and demanded an A team. And you'll get the A team when they're selling to you and the first guys that show up. And after that, if you don't push back and do what we said yesterday with having that resume review and interviewing people, being diligent about who's coming on the team, you'll end up with just young people or inexperienced people that just don't know what they're doing, and they just waste time and make mistakes, and you don't even see it happening. It's like some sort of bleeding, behind the scenes.
My very first project when I was at PwC, I was 24, 25, I guess I was.
You were that guy.
Yeah, I was that guy. I'm the problem that you're. But I remember when I was there, they put me on this project when I first started, and they had me focus on this. There's the returns process for this telecommunication company. And they said, we want you to re-engineer the returns process, which was actually cool. I enjoyed doing it. But we would go there, and the expectation was you're fully dedicated to this project. You're going to build, we're going to be on site. We'd get there at 7:45 every day. We couldn't leave before like 7 or 8 at night. So we built at least 12, 13 hours a day. And I remember being like, I've got like 2 or 3 hours of work to do in a day. And I was scrounging up work. Like, can I help somewhere else? Like, I'm sitting here without a ton to do. And it went on for months. And I remember thinking, like, why am I feel bad, like I'm billing so much, but I had to, that was my job. And they put me on the project. I had to report my time, and that's what I was doing. And so no one ever, no one from the client ever knew, and they never seemed to care or notice or whatever. And it just, I don't know. So that left a lasting impression on me too. Like that just doesn't, it wasn't just me. I saw it happen all the time. Like, oh, this kid at college over here we need to get him on a project. Let's put him over here. We'll have him do something that, someone else, you could have paid someone, $20 an hour to do, but we'll pay him $200 an hour. The client will pay him $200 an hour to do it. So,
And a good independent project manager, program manager will do resource planning and work breakdown structures and know exactly what everybody's supposed to be doing every week and tracking those hours against that. And that's what you need. But if you let them lead their own project, they will not do that because they cannot obfuscate for that type of, situation. And that's really important.
Yeah, one last thing I would like to add on this conversation is when we go after these branded SIs, the reality is we are probably in a phase of the project that we need this resources right away. So there may not be folks on the bench or in the tiered company. What they do is then they start advertising. This goes to the second tier, third tier companies, and all they care about is getting their profit margins. They don't care about the consultant quality. At that point, it just becomes like, okay, we're just taking a body from here, putting them under the name brand of this SI and start billing to the same point what you just mentioned.
Yeah. So you just need oversight.
Yes.
Also, something. I was going to say, ask for real S4 experience. SAP and S4, they are separate. They translate, they can kind of cross-train.
experience versus
Ask for real S4 experience.
But
that's
honestly,
yeah.
there just aren't enough.
they're not. So that's a challenge.
Yeah.
That's right, because when they bring in army of S4, then you need to question it.
They're not there.
Yeah.
They might have received some training, but they don't have a hands-on training because there just aren't enough implementations that people have gone through. So I think we're all in the same boat with that.
But it's a great opportunity for you as a client because if we're all learning together, or we're all learning this, and let's learn it together, and that gives you an opportunity to get ahead of it and have more internal competency built around it. Because if you're going to train someone or learn on your dime, then might as well be someone internal.
Absolutely.
And even if they say they have S4 experience.
Yep.
How much has what is functionally available within SAP and the application of that shifted with the S/4HANA? I know there's a lot on that HANA side, but as you think about, how you would configure or at least design the SAP solution for a particular business process, is that
I think finance is a big one that's solid on S4. Others are still in legacy world.
Okay,
The honest truth, some of the stuff doesn't really work well yet,
okay,
and it's not as integrated as they'll tell you. They'll tell you trade shift is integrated with Ariba, is integrated with Fieldglass, it's going to do this. It just does not. I think the core functionality, the basic business
Okay.
functions are okay. I didn't see anything on the last round that was alarming in that way, but just connecting it to everything else, they literally either are lying or they don't know. I've sat there with Deloitte and SAP in front of me, and they say, well, it's connected to this, and you just connect it up. I'm like, no, you're with the client. We spent the last 6 months trying to figure out how to do this, and you can't tell us how to do this. It does not work.
Mhm.
Yeah. It'll come.
Yeah.
It's gonna come. We're all in the same boat. You just have to live with it. But just don't be naive. Don't believe everything they tell you. Just stick to your core and don't go out on a limb thinking that this massive thing like he put up is gonna just connect. It just doesn't happen like that.
that's helpful advice for, trying to identify scope things, is to understanding that risk right now. And, if we're gonna err on the side of maybe delaying some of that if it's not really core value creation for the first go live.
Yeah, wait on the fancy stuff.
Yeah, okay.
I think Jennifer or others from Saskatoon, did you guys have something you wanted to add or ask?
Can you hear us?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Does anyone have any questions? We have not now.
Okay. Yeah, just keep pinging me or send me a chat if I'm not hearing you or not giving you an opening there.
Perfect.
Okay, good deal. So some of the things to think about is we think about what's actually going to enable this transformation. On the right side, or on the left side, I'm sorry, the transformation enablers are the technology, your implementation partner or partners, your internal team. Those are some of the things that will enable the change. But then you look at what are the layers of transformation, and there's the one second box, the technical piece, is where typically obviously the technology and most implementation partners are focused on. But the reality of what's going to make the project succeed or not is usually the people, process, and business side of things. So that's where implementation readiness comes in as well. So how do we address that? How do we make sure that we've got alignment around that so that the technology piece ends up fitting well within that parameter or structure?
How do you differentiate business and process?
Yeah, so it's more, I'd say more the, when you're talking about more general operating model, like, so business process is more processes and workflows, and what we all traditionally think of processes. When we talk at the business level, it's more what is our operating model in general if we're going to combine, consolidate operations or move to a shared service model. So a bit of process, it's part people too, but it's more just the general operating model. We see a lot of companies are trying to figure that out as they go. Is we haven't yet figured out how we want to. We say we want a HR shared service model, and we're going to use HCM to drive some of that, but we haven't defined yet what that means and what it looks like. So let's, that's the business pieces. Let's figure out what that is first. Then we'll figure out the processes and the technology, and the organizational change a little bit.
And I would also call these business as the line of business, which is the finance or marketing. Yeah. And these the processes as the steps that go through each of those.
Yeah. And then when we look at what's going to affect the complexity, and what we mean by, or the reason we look at complexity is how long is this going to take, how much is it going to cost, how difficult will the change be. These are the different layers of what impacts typically the implementation duration. And so the problem when you get a proposal from a system integrator or from SAP Direct, typically you're getting kind of that canned, in general, this is how we would implement these modules, the scope would generally take this long. And generally, I think they do have a good sense of what it would take to design and build and test the software, but it's all this other stuff that really drives, the dependencies here. And so when we look at the degree of process change, if we're back to that ERP versus digital transformation discussion yesterday, if we're talking about massive process changes and we're really trying to, take this to a whole nother level as part of the transformation, that's different and will take longer than if we say we're just but we're just going to replace our existing processes, leave our processes largely the same, but put new technology in there to support it. Those are two very different timelines, different cost scenarios, and so we have to understand what the degree of process change is. Same with people. What is the degree of impact on people? I talked to one client this week, earlier than the week, that makes they make consumer products, and the company was founded 14 years ago and has grown to $1 billion plus in revenue. They just went public this year, and a lot of change in the company. But the good news with them is they don't have a lot of baggage that a lot of more established companies have that are multi-billion dollars. So it's not that the change is easy for them, but it was a different profile than a company that's been around forever, has highly tenured people that have been around 20, 30 years. Not to name names that are here, but
We don't know any of those.
Yeah, you don't know any of those, I know. But that makes it harder to change. And in that situation, if I put those two companies side by side, it's probably going to be the company that has more tenured employees is probably going to take longer to change than the one that is more, is newer or whatever. Same with technological change. A company that's running on an old S400 system, shifting to S4HANA is a lot different than a company that's using an old version of SAP or even some sort of semi-modern ERP system. That's just a different magnitude of change. So those are the three biggest impacts we found on implementation, duration, complexity, cost. And then some of the other things are, just the functional scope, how much you're expanding the scope of your ERP, what you have today versus what you're going to use in S4HANA, geographic scope, how many locations. Your internal team's experience with these types of projects also has a pretty big impact. It's easy to say we'll just kind of augment our team with more outside help, but that you get diminishing returns at some point where you need a certain amount of internal competency. And companies that haven't been through it before, they usually struggle a lot more with no matter how many consultants they hire, no matter if they hire us or who are the best people in the world to do this. It doesn't matter if they haven't done it before. They just don't know and they don't have the right mindset. And it's a little bit harder to change. And then if there's any time pressures, time-based time sensitivities that can affect obviously your duration and cost too. So having said all that, we're trying to get a big picture view of what does this change mean, what kind of magnitude of change is this, how do we get ready for it? So when we get into the readiness itself, these are the 5 major work streams we typically look at, and we're going to dive into each of these in more of a Gantt chart type of format and then unpack each of those one by one. So I won't talk about the green boxes in much detail right now because we'll get to that in a second. But in general, you're looking at strategic and executive alignment, starting first and starting early. Not that you can't run other things in parallel, but generally that's one of the first things you want to do is make sure that we've got the support and education and appreciation for what this project is and what it's going to mean to the organization and how to translate the strategic goals into the project. Operational readiness is more around the business processes and making sure that we have an understanding of what we want our processes to be. And I'll use it again. I know I'm incorrectly using the term business blueprint, but that's the way I think of it is you are creating a true business blueprint of what we want the business to be. And then that's going to drive S/4HANA, which will then include a blueprint of S/4HANA, but I'm talking more true business blueprint here. And then technical readiness is when we look at things like data, which Daryl's going to talk a lot about, so I won't even try to touch on that right now because I'll just get shamed by Daryl in the process. And then, also reports, solution architecture, how the systems are going to tie together. People readiness is all the change management piece of it. And then project governance is that underlying thing that runs in parallel along the way, which is really just making sure we have a clear charter, project governance roles, risk mitigation plans and frameworks, all that sort of thing. So the idea here is how do we get ready so that we can optimally engage with the system integrator and really be more of a partner with the system integrator rather than an outsourced vendor that may take a little bit more ownership and control than we need or want them to. And it also helps our team get ready for the implementation. And it's really just to engage the internal organization to make progress, to learn, to build the competencies, build a framework, build a blueprint to be able to manage this thing successfully going forward. And then typically, the way we or it, you can insert another company with third stage too, an independent party, but having an independent party, your internal team, your system integrator is kind of a triangulation that can be extremely effective, and we found to work really well. And that, first of all, notice who's at the top. I mean, you're at the top driving this. We're not, the system integrator it's not anyone else. It's you guys owning it. It's your project. And think of yourselves as, the person that's, having a house built. You're gonna commission a architect, you're gonna commission a general contractor and so on. But it's you that's defining, this is what I want. This is my vision for the house. This is how I want it to look. This is the color I want and all that stuff. And then companies like us, think of us as more of a general contractor, someone that can help define how it's all going to fit together and how the blueprint comes together, what plumber we'll use and where we need the electrician to come in and when we're going to do the drywall and all that stuff. System integrators is, a subcontractor as well that would provide more of the system-based expertise that's going to help manage that part of the transformation. And there may be other parties as well. If there's other data or change management, if that independent party can't handle that, you might have other parties that you're bringing in as well. But the idea here is that when at least in our view of how we work with clients, it's generally a three-way process here where you have someone helping you really be an extension of your PMO, which is the role we play. You're almost an extension of your own PMO, providing the internal QA and oversight, helping you provide oversight of the SI. And then also plugging the holes and the gaps with what the SI isn't equipped to do or you don't necessarily want them to do.
So, go ahead, Wayne. I know what question you're going to ask.
No.
So.
I'll
let you ask
the question
it.
I'm going to ask is, and where would SAP be in this?
Thank you.
Would there be a fourth?
First of all, they could be the system integrator for using their professional services group. But I'd kind of put them maybe in the middle, that it's kind of they're providing a solution, obviously, and there's a certain amount of interaction, like we talked about yesterday, that we want to have with them. But I typically, when it comes to the implementation itself and the overall transformation, it's mostly these parties. SAP is more providing the software unless you're using them more on the services side as well, which a lot of companies do.
So would third stage then, for example, this is what I've experienced already, and I've experienced almost nothing, is there's quite a bit of debate between the system integrator and SAP as to who has more software functional and technical expertise, who has design rights, who blah, blah, blah. And I'm thinking this is interesting. Both of them claim to have, so does third stage in this example play a role there to help figure out like who should have what decisions? Where?
Yeah, because we don't have any skin in the game, so we don't care, whether SAP's right or the SI's right, or, we can objectively determine who.
Well, how do we know you have the software functional and technical, right?
You're right.
So everybody's claiming to have
Right.
the functional technical expertise.
So I can answer that. So I have been in roles where I have gone as part of SAP and certified the design based on the version of that product.
So as SAP, you
I have
certify
done
the design.
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
Gotcha.
Have SAP certify the design. That way they are sticking to their story that this works and they are liable to that.
Mhm.
So that is one way to, but again, these kind of things, third stage can advise that has to be incorporated into your plan.
Yeah,
Thanks.
and even though, Jacob is arguably one of our, or not arguably, is one of our top, 3 to 4 people with the S/4HANA experience, but we in general as a company we don't have the depth and breadth of volume of competency in S/4HANA as SAP does. Obviously, we're not saying that we've got that, or even, an Accenture, Deloitte, or one of those guys. But what we are really good at is having some of that knowledge, but more importantly, having the agnostic approach to how you manage and make those decisions that you're asking. So I wouldn't say that, we're going to know way more SAP or Accenture, because we won't.
Well, they each claim the other one knows
Yes.
more and less. It's really fascinating to listen.
That is interesting. Were you going to say ridiculous? I thought I heard you almost say
No,
ridiculous.
it's fascinating. Let's just say it's really
I
interesting.
noticed your pivot there at the last minute.
Thank
before
you.
the word came out.
I caught myself.
Good catch.
Eric, I think one of my challenges I'm going through right now is trying to communicate to my exec team who should I hire to manage this project most successfully, and everyone's like, well, maybe you'll get 2 people. It's a very sensitive subject because no one thinks I need people to do this. They just think I should just farm this all out, and I'm the guy in between, and it's all going to work out. If we hired you guys to help with some of this PM work, I'm trying to understand how much would I need a PM on my side? Is that just going to be me? I know the system integrator will have a PM, but I think I'm just trying to kind of now figure out how I kind of put a proposed org chart together and how much of because I'd love to hire an SAP specific PM that knows SAP, but if that's something you guys can do and I can have myself or someone who's not as experienced with SAP do that,
Yeah.
So that's what I'm trying to figure out.
Yeah, I think so. On the PM project management side, if you think of yourself as a more of a program manager, and then we're kind of off on the side, being an extension of you, helping you do a lot of the heavy lifting, but ultimately you're still owning it, driving it, and then you're managing the the functional technical resources, whatever other consultants you need to support it, and the internal resources too. I think the internal getting involvement from your business on the internal team is, I don't want to say it's more important than the program management. Program management is critical, but that doesn't matter if you don't have that business involvement. So getting the right business leaders involved in decision making and making sure their hands are in this is really important. Otherwise, it's going to be on you, and you're going to say, "Oh, why'd you make this decision?" Or when that doesn't fit our business, that's not what we need. Or I told you it wasn't going to work. I mean, that's the last thing you need is that kind of conversation. So I advocate more for, in your case, I'd say, okay, if you're the program manager and you've got support in that level, then your focus can be on how do I get more the right internal involvement and buy-in. And it might take you some time to do that, and you have to focus some time on that. And I would focus time on that before you start trying to implement, because the dynamic gets unhealthy internally pretty quick when people start gunning for you and saying, yeah, Erwin made this decision.
Right.
First time a problem comes up, it's your fault, and you don't want that or need that.
But I think we shouldn't overlook the technical tools that a professional SAP PM can bring to the table with regard to that resource planning and really detailed project plans specific to S/4HANA that weave in all the activities that you're doing, all the activities that the masses of worker bees are doing, and then also has those milestones in there and is helping support. Sometimes you can pick it up, you just need the template and you run with it. Other times, and I'm so sorry, I forgot how complex and how big your is, but on large projects, I mean, it is a full-time job. Somebody, the only thing they do is manage that project plan, sit in the weekly meetings, attend all the sub-team meetings, and reclass those resource plans continually to understand what is everybody doing, and then help measure that against the billings that are coming in as well if you're not on a flat rate contract. So those are core skills. You can get a template if it's small enough. We can help provide templates and things like that as part of that service. But if you need somebody to come in, I wouldn't rule that out if it's a big project. I think you'll have more success with that.
I want to make sure I understood something you just said. So there will be an SAP mirror PM along with an internal program manager. Is that what you're suggesting?
I see that a lot.
For
Sure. Yeah. It's a specific skill set. That's the person that sets what are the sign-off processes for every stage, where are we going to put our documents, holding people's feet to the fire that things are signed off and that we do not advance to the next stage on anything unless that's kept, unless we've gone through the agreed upon process. They're managing and helping oversee that change management, the change control process, not change management process, but change control. They're making sure that anytime anything comes up, there's a specific process for agreeing on changes and that the right people are notified and they're signed off on. Those are the things that you'll find as stuff gets kind of rapid. If you don't have that person that has the skills to and the time to watch all of that, all of a sudden the foxes start running the hen house. and it's not that they're trying to get away with something, it's just that it's so many people. You're talking about hundreds of people on a large implementation, hundreds. Schlumberger, 1,000 people. 1,000.
Can I just add my experience? So what I have seen working the best is having Jack Welch's 4 in the box kind of like a model. So we just show you how that works. So we have these various tracks once you kick off these projects, and you have finance and all of these various tracks going in parallel. So you have your business, you have your IT, again, this is from the customer side. Then you have SAP, as well as your systems integrator, track leads for each one. So this is for finance. So similarly, you have one for supply chain, you have one for order management. So it's important that these 4 at the leadership level come to a decision-making and agreement at every stage.
And usually when I come in, I'm sitting in the IT bucket. Like even if I get hired in or one of my teams gets hired in and come in under the SI and they sub to us, oftentimes they say, we want an independent, in my case independent data team. They'll carve out and they'll say, you don't report to that integrator. We want a direct report to the head of IT. And that sometimes that's an option too. So even if you're using people and sub teams, you still can change and do contractually who are they going to report to and the responsibility, instead of letting them all tier up and then now you're just dealing with one quadrant that's now taken over pretty much all the activities. Yeah. And sometimes SAP is the system integrator these days. I know you know for some.
What happened is that they had cut down a lot of the consulting wing. They have shrunken that.
Yeah, it's going back up again now. I'm seeing it. I'm bumping into them. They're coming back. I think they want to make sure it goes right too. I think they know that there's some problems and they want to make sure that they see those firsthand and get to fix them. I think it's a good thing, not a bad thing.
I think they let their system integrators run the implementations, and it created a lot of bad PR.
A lot of more lawsuits, yeah.
So I think now they are more engaged. We see SAP a lot more engaged from the account executive being published upon the way. So that's good.
It's definitely changed in the last year.
And they need more, they're trying really hard to get more referenceable S4HANA clients that are up and running on S4HANA, and they know they don't have enough. And 93% of SAP customers haven't yet committed to S4HANA, so they're trying to get those 93% to a reason to switch over and not be one of the first and not be on the bleeding, too much on the bleeding edge.
Even the 2025 deadline, I think it's now changing.
Oh, is it?
You're trying to a lot of pressure on them. Yeah. So one other thing is engaging SAP to the degree, I think it is a larger discussion. We can talk about it maybe in a separate discussion. That itself is a discussion, like how to and what parts of SAP we need to talk.
All right, so the components of implementation readiness then, so these are all the things that you typically want to do up until you've selected or leading up to the selection. You may have done some of these things, you may not have. So some of these things may slip into the implementation readiness, and some of these things continue into implementation readiness. But typically when we're helping clients define their overall strategy and help evaluate and select the software and just get to that point where they've made a decision and commitment to a certain technology and then are ready to move forward, the next phase after this would be that implementation readiness. So here's where you've done the initial assessment, the kind of the high level view of what you have now, what your needs are, where you're headed, and then you arrived at the decision for S4HANA. That's where this comes in. The next slide will come in. And so when we look at, and I know this is hard to read, and a lot of you have probably seen this slide and other collateral, but the whole Activate methodology. When you look at the Activate methodology, that it's a an upgraded or an updated improvement to the ASAP methodology that they used to have for ECC and R3. And so there's a lot of stuff in here, but if you look at it and when you dive into the methodology, it's very, as you might expect, very solution technology focused. It's how you build the software and design it and integrate it and use the SAP tool sets that they're known for and so good at. But the things that are missing are some of the things that you should be doing before you get to that. And so not putting the cart before the horse. And so just at a high level, the things around your organizational design and how you're going to design the organization going forward, whether it's new processes or restructuring how the business is going to operate. And that's largely going to be enabled by S4HANA, but we want to define what that's going to mean and get the pieces of the puzzle moving on that, because usually that stuff, it's going to take you a lot longer to figure out how your organization is going to look and get the political buy-in and actually make that happen than it is to get the software to do what you want it to do, because you're dealing with people. They're always harder to change than the technology. Standardizing your processes, what's that going to look like? How much do we really want to standardize? Maybe we don't want to standardize. Maybe we want to just standardize within business units, or in your guys' case, or like we see at a lot of companies. But whatever it is, we want to get on the same page with what that's going to be and how it's going to look, what the impact of the organization is going to be, so that we can start working on communicating and working those changes through the system, building the skills and competencies, and then building those internal S4HANA competencies. So those are all things that are missing in Activate, among the things that are missing in Activate that we want to address here with implementation readiness. So by the time we get to the Activate methodology, we can focus on those things and have a very clear vision for how we're going to leverage S4 and Activate to make all that happen.
Eric, can you give an example of a competency, non-technical, that we want to look at, or what might some of those things be?
Sure. So, for example, just like a process excellence type of competency. Like some companies say we want to pursue process excellence, or improve the customer experience. That could be another one. Customer experience, a CX competency. And just building almost a center of excellence around that. And certainly S4HANA should eventually become part of that, because it's going to enable a lot of it. But we want to build that competency internally. And it's not really about just learning SAP. It's about how do we improve processes. Yeah. Or like some companies are using Lean Six Sigma, might be building that kind of competency. But it just depends on what you're trying to pursue. And so I'm going to skip a couple of these slides because I think they're better. Story is better told visually here, but those 5 work streams I talked about just a couple slides back on the left side of the screen, now we're viewing this more from a semi-sequential semi-sequential Gantt chart type of view, and I'm going to turn off my email in the next session so that beeping stops, so I apologize for that. So the idea here is that we, in the strategic and executive alignment, there's a number of things that happen in parallel. And the reality is, obviously, this is a PowerPoint high level, so that a lot of this, it's not quite as clean and sequential as it might suggest here. A lot of this does happen more in parallel to what you're seeing here. And I'm going to unpack each of these one by one, so I'll let you kind of digest that overall, but then we go through each of these 5 work streams in a little bit more detail to make sense. So as we go through the next few slides, I'm going to pick off just one of those work streams and unpack it a little bit more. So on the strategic and executive alignment, this is where we want to start with educating executives, first of all, because a lot of times companies at the executive level will think that, you know, this is just a lift and shift, this is just an IT project, let's plan and budget accordingly, right? And so we need to educate on what this really means to the organization and really get alignment on what do you want this to be to the organization. You could certainly make it an IT project. Here's what that looks like. Here's what the reality of that is. It's probably not going to be, you're not going to get as much out of it as you might expect if you treat it that way. And if you're good with that, then that's okay too. But don't expect to get, you know, massive changes to your business if that's the way you're gonna treat it. And so really just educating on what this means more at an executive level, and that's something that I do for a lot of our clients is working at that executive level to help educate and help just be able to translate kind of the executive strategic priorities into what it means for this project. The overall project strategy articulation too. We want to make sure that we understand, back to that strategic articulation we talked about yesterday, making sure we translate corporate objectives into specific project goals and measures and things of that nature. We also, in this case, will look at stakeholder alignment and starting to assess who are the key stakeholders, how aligned are we, where are we misaligned, and how are we going to start to work on getting more alignment there. You've always got people at the executive level and even on down, especially at more the mid-level management level, highly tenured people. A lot of times you might have informal influencers and people that could derail this project, or we really need to get them on board. And so we start to identify, you know, who those stakeholders are and how to get them on board and how to communicate with them frequently throughout the process. Business decisions, making sure that we are escalating the right decisions to the executive team. And really, a lot of times what I try to do is I try to put the pressure on the executive team to take more of the onus on making decisions, because a lot of times they want to push it down to the project team because that's a natural tendency of executives, is to delegate, trust your team, and they certainly need to do that. But there are key business decisions that need to be made and that will come up during this process that we need them to make and to, at the very least, sign off on and be aware of and be comfortable with. And that also takes the pressure on a lot of us as product team members or executive sponsors or whatever. It puts it back at the executive steering committee level to make sure that they are the ones owning this and making the decisions and validating decisions. And then executive management communications, making sure we've got the right communications plan. And then also having that top right box there, that stage gate review, making sure that before we've moved into the next stage of kind of, call it the full-blown implementation, that they feel comfortable that we're ready. Usually you're never quite ready, but are you ready enough becomes the question. And here are the risks, here are the things we haven't addressed yet. Are we ready to go forward or not? If not, let's keep doing what we need to do. And if so, then let's move forward and mitigate the risk.
So Eric, is this process any different if we block out S/4HANA and just insert ERP, or like how is this process specific to S/4HANA, or it's really generic?
No,
it doesn't have to be about
no, it doesn't
S/4HANA.
have to be S/4HANA.
Okay.
You just exposed me completely busted on it. It is completely technology agnostic. It's not. The only difference is that it's gonna look inherently. It's gonna end up looking different in the tactical details because of the nature of S/4HANA and what it can enable and the risk factor, the risk profile of it. But the actual framework we go through, it doesn't vary at all. You can plug in Oracle and Microsoft and everything.
This could be used for any large initiatives, large transformation
Yeah.
projects. It's not specific to ERP.
Yeah. Exactly.
Eric, excuse me, Paul Konevsky, can I ask a question?
Sure.
This may be a finer point or a too detailed point, but I'm sort of surprised there's nothing on there with regard to resourcing, because in conjunction with the belief that, oh, this is just an IT project or a technology project, I don't need to worry about it, may be the assumption that this is going to be staffed entirely by IT and technical people, and I don't need anyone from my team, where I guess I would argue that, you know, we need some of the best and brightest from their team in order to have the system actually do what they want it to do.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. And it is covered in here, I believe. Let me see if it's on the, let me skip ahead here.
Oh, okay. All right.
On the project governance and planning, you kind of build out that second box here, right in the middle of your screen where it says build out project team and organization.
Okay.
That's where we're kind of building out the project team, not just the direct core team, but also the subject matter experts and other
Yeah.
teams.
And I was just curious because I think that needs to be part of the discussion with that leadership team that, oh yeah, this is not something that is just going to happen to you. You know, we're going to need some of your best and brightest, and be prepared for that.
Yeah, absolutely. And you bring up a really good point, because even though I know this is just PowerPoint, the reality of how you execute, it's all integrated. And so we're trying to break it out for visual purposes, but the reality is actually not just what you bring up there, but when you look at other work streams here, for example, like when we get to operational readiness, when you look at some of the business processes, the third box there, validate business processes and requirements, a lot of times that is something too that it ends up escalating, or it ends up going back to the steering committee and becoming part of that strategic alignment. So a lot of the bits and pieces throughout the rest of implementation readiness do bubble back up to the top layer there. It's just, you know, this is kind of that overarching layer, what we start with, and then other parts of those other 4 work streams are inevitably going to bubble back up to the strategic level, depending on how we've set up the governance on the bottom layer. If that makes sense. So you have certain things, like for some companies, there's certain process decisions that
Yeah.
we're inherently going to escalate, but other companies might say we're not going to escalate that. It's going to be more mid-level management or whatever. So that's the governance we have to define early on.
Thank you.
One of the things that we've recognized in the last few years is that we're relatively strong thinkers on business process when we put it in a functional silo, but we really are challenged when we start thinking and operating across horizontal processes. And that caused us some challenges after we went live with our last ERP implementation. And we started thinking about it from an integrated supply chain standpoint. And we're still working through how does the organization think that way, and how do they understand how, yeah, you don't need that here, but it's going to impact these folks in this space, and that has been a challenge.
Yeah.
I think that cross-functional is going to be a challenge. This is where I think you were mentioning organizations are looking for more generalists than specialists. That way they can go cross-functional, so you can see how finance and sales, finance and supply chain. You need to have those skill sets, either build in-house or bring from outside.
Yeah.
Generalists.
And in the early stages, identifying the people that have those skill sets, you should be searching for them and grooming them, and then building compensation plans, bonus structures for them to participate. The worst thing is to point at somebody in a regular job and say, we're going to give you this extra job, not give them any money, not give them the title and acknowledgement of what they're doing, and expect it to succeed. They just quit, or they become disgruntled, or they just get overwhelmed, and you've now ruined your production person, and you know you've sabotaged and undermined your project. So yeah, finding those smart people, and they're not necessarily the managers.
Yeah.
They're the bright kids that are, you know, they are the people that maybe they're not the greatest manager in the world, but they know their stuff. They're curious, they work hard, and they can organize themselves. So you know, those folks and drag them onto the team.
Yeah. All right, so operational readiness. This is where we start to get into the process work. And a lot of times companies think, well, you know, don't we do that as part of the SAP blueprint in the Activate methodology? Don't we define that, you know, the business blueprint as part of the business blueprinting? And we do, but getting back to that, I don't know if we talked about it here, if it's a different session, but the layers of business processes that we have to define start at level 0, which is the super high level, and then we work our way all the way down to level 5, which is more transactional, screen by screen, keystroke by keystroke, what we do. What we're trying to do is figure out that level 0 and 1, maybe level 2 level of detail. So getting down to maybe the mid-level that think of it as where you start to bump up against it starts to matter. We stop at the point where it matters what technology you're using, or the technology is going to determine how that process is going to look. When you're above that line, wherever that line is, it doesn't matter what technology you're using. This is how we operate as a business. This is what we're going to do, whether we're using S/4HANA or whether we're using a pen and paper. This is the stuff we're going to do. And so that's the level of detail we typically want to get at. And we don't do it for all business processes. A lot of times what we do is we'll segment business processes into 2 buckets. We'll have the ones that are the strategic differentiators, the things that are unique to us, or the things that are unique to our customer experience, or whatever the case may be. And then you've got the other bucket that's more, call it commodity business processes, where it's not that we don't care how the processes look, but we can probably adjust to whatever S/4HANA can do. And we don't necessarily need a super clear vision of how we want that software to work. And so usually that's the balance that most clients land at. They don't want to do a super deep dive on everything, but they will pick off some areas that are very important, or they're particularly challenged. They're problem areas in the company right now. We know we need to fix them. So let's take a first stab to finding what that's going to look like. And then when we get to the SAP blueprinting phase, that will further define, I'll flush out in more detail what that's going to look like. But it's almost like you're creating a blueprint for the blueprint. You've got the clear business blueprint so that we can build the technical blueprint within the Activate methodology.
So, how does it translate? Is the transition from the business blueprint to SAP Activate S4 blueprint, is that pretty seamless? And have you guys considered all the Activate components? Because once you're in that Activate blueprinting, you don't want to go back, right? You don't want.
Right.
You may go to small iterations, but you don't want to. Oh my God, we missed a big piece.
Right.
That we should have identified.
Yeah. If you're driving the business piece of it first, then there shouldn't be anything you've missed. If we're doing our jobs right on the business side. Now, where you mentioned 2 things. One is there will be some iteration. There's inevitably going to be areas where you come back and say, okay, this doesn't quite work. This box or these 2 boxes right here, that's not going to work in S/4HANA, and we've got to figure out how it could work. And there is some reconciliation that happens there, but that's, in the grand scheme of things, that's fairly minor, and it's certainly not worth not doing the exercise in the first place. But the other part that you mentioned that's probably even more important with S/4HANA is then within Activate, you'll start to identify functionality that maybe we hadn't thought of, or that we could use to add to that business blueprint, to further enable whatever it is we're trying to accomplish. So like, for example, machine learning, we may not design our business blueprint to say we're going to use machine learning to automate our accounts payable process. We might. Actually, we probably would. But I'm just using it as an example of one that, if I didn't know about machine learning, or I didn't know that SAP could do that, or that's a bad example because we do know it does it. But I'm thinking of other things that we hadn't thought of that could be part of our business strategy going forward. Then we might use that to then build into the overall blueprint.
Like RPA or something.
Yeah, that's good.
Okay.
The one good thing about the fact that we're all under resource constraints, including SAP, and trying to get all this done, is before, if you presented them with a really complex legacy system, them and the system integrators would, if you didn't stop them or didn't know better, would attempt to rebuild exactly what you had, because then that's a nice big fat project. It's going to go on forever, and we all know that's a lot of risk. That's not what you should do. But now they actually can't. They either can't or they won't. So I think in a good way, businesses are going to be forced into adopting more generic models for doing things, that they should approach it like, we're going to have to change. We can't. The world is different now. And I think we've reached that point with all this cloud software and all the things that we deal with just generally in our lives, that I think you can help the businesses understand a little bit more, people in the business, a little bit more that, hey, just like when we got our smartphones, we just don't do things the same way that we used to do. That's happened now in our business, and we really should take this opportunity to embrace what they have already built, because they did this based on the collective of all these businesses around the world, and designed as much option and flexibility as they could. But it's a pretty solid process, and try to stick with that. So I think it's actually a good thing in a way.
Yeah.
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 They're not going to design your crystal castle for you and charge you millions of dollars, and then you sue them.
Yeah. Well, one thing I want to point out too before I move off this slide is that on the right side of the light blue blocks on the far right side at the top, implementing processes and procedures. Well, one thing we find is that a lot of times by going through the business blueprint exercise, you identify process improvements and changes to your standard operating procedures that you can be making now, and you don't necessarily need to wait for S/4HANA. Some things obviously you can't do yet, machine learning or whatever functionality is going to enable. But usually, in rough terms, somewhere between 30 and 50% of process improvements we identify in that early stage, you can start implementing now. And what it does is it allows you to get the benefit of having those improvements in place sooner than later. And it also makes, from a change management perspective, makes it easier than just waiting until go live to just bring all the changes in mass on the employees. So it's always surprising to companies like, oh, we could just start doing this now. We don't have to wait. I mean, S/4HANA is going to make it easier. We're going to have to change a little bit again, but we can at least take a step towards it now. And then we'll already have baked in, those processes will have kind of marinated, become baked into the way we operate. And then the technology then comes in and further automates it.
And we're calling the foundational in preparation for the implementation.
That's what you're calling it?
Yeah, we're calling it foundation. Looking at the processes that we can improve now.
Yeah.
To your point, that's 30 to 40% improvement is pretty good.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's 30 to 40% less that people won't have to deal with on day one of go live.
Yep.
They're already freaking out anyway, so it's just more we can take off their plate.
And they're getting used to that thinking and cultural change, and they're starting to think more enterprise-wide and all.
Yeah, especially when it's a company that's trying to get more structure in place. If you're using S/4HANA to give you more structure, I hate to say more hierarchy or more approvals, but a lot of times it's more, you're trying to get more layers in place and approvals and
harmonization.
Yeah,
You're really trying to harmonize your processes. I think you all are, and that's it's a great opportunity.
Yeah, because that'll take a long time, and hopefully by doing that too, by the time S/4HANA comes in, you've already done that hard work, and then it does become more just it's just a technology shift at that point, because you've already changed the process, you've already changed the people. Now we just lay the technology on top of it. Easier said. I made it sound real easy. But
yeah, you can also put them out to businesses by talking to them nonstop for 3 years, going, come back again, you guys are going to change something again.
Yeah, I know.
We're going to give one of our resources again for another 6 months for you guys to talk to you. So.
But I think as long as you put it in the context of the overall big picture, this is everything we're doing, and here's where we're at right now, and here's why we're doing this now, and here's what's going to happen later on. I think that's where companies fall short, because if people don't see that, and then the stuff just keeps changing. Yeah.
There's nothing more impressive than going into an organization that's in their SAP, in the stride, and you sit down with different people and you look at the wall and they have a roadmap of what the project is overall and how it's going to affect them in each of the stages. Now we're doing this, and then in Q4 we start this, and they know that, and that's so valuable, because just they know what's going on, and they're rowing in that direction, and they don't feel as overwhelmed. And I think that's that beginning change management stuff, and then aligning and communicating that it's a huge difference. Instead of like, I don't know what they're doing, every week they change something else, and it's ridiculous, and I can't figure it out. And I get that a lot too, and that's a badly run project.
Yeah,
it's a fight upstream.
That's when you don't have the skin in the game.
Yeah, well, they're just
relying on your providers to drive it.
I mean, you're always going to have the cranky people.
If you lay out the roadmap and people don't like it, they'll leave in the beginning and not stick around.
Hey, why not? I mean, that's
if they can't.
they can't get along, then they can go.
We should follow Dilbert.
Right.
You'll see a lot of that.
And then here's a slide that just shows how we typically will address the business process improvement piece of it. And so as it relates to that work stream, the things we typically will walk through to help clients start with business goals, identify where the pain points are, and then get to that future state process model. As well as the benefits and metrics that go along with that. And then it starts to identify some of the change impacts and risks as well. And what that all does is it becomes input into your future state requirements, digital strategy and roadmap. How are we gonna deploy S/4HANA? And keep in mind here too, we're still, we haven't started the implementation earnest yet, but now we're uncovering all the stuff about how big the mailbox is, and now we can come up with a realistic strategy and plan based on everything we've defined in this implementation readiness phase. If any of us try to define the implementation plan before the implementation readiness, it's a shot in the dark. We don't really know, how big the changes are, what the process improvements are going to be, how the people are going to change, all that stuff. So we've got to define all that as inputs into the plan. And then the people readiness component, this is the organizational change piece. And for the implementation readiness phase, we cherry pick the low-hanging fruit as it relates to organizational change to really help set a foundation for the overall change program later on in the transformation. So some of the things we focus on here in this are the skills and competency gaps, and really understanding what those gaps are in terms of what we have now versus what we're going to need in the future. And that applies to your IT group, certainly. You want to build out your S/4HANA and other capabilities related to that. But then also even within the business, if we know we're moving a certain direction with our processes and the way we're headed as an organization, it may be that we need to build out certain skills within the organization. If we're building, for example, building centers of excellence or shared service models, we just have to figure out what that skill set is we need and how we're going to build it internally and or bring in outside, hire people into the organization. This is where we start to identify the change team itself. So throughout the transformation, who is that change team going to be? And primarily, we're focusing on the internal change team, who are the change agents and the others that are going to be trainers, for example, training the trainers. We want to start identifying all these roles that we need to fill on the change team, especially internally, because that's usually harder to fill. People readiness, doing organizational or people readiness assessment early on is important because that tells you how resistant the organization is going to be to change. And right now, we're probably all hearing that, and we're all sensing that everyone's ready for the change because they probably are ready for the change, and they're saying they're ready for the change. But there's inevitably going to be resistance, not because people don't want to change, but because you're forcing them to change, and they are going to have to change, and they're human, and there is going to be, instead of viewing it as they're going to resist the change, view it as there's going to be obstacles to them changing. We've got to figure out what those obstacles are and how to start removing those now. And so that organizational readiness assessment is intended to identify those obstacles that maybe we're not seeing right now because everyone's ready for the change and saying they're ready, but we know there's landmines out there, and let's identify them, because every company's culture and every company's way of operating in MO has its own landmines that's unique to them. And every good, I was talking to these guys at Gore recently about how every strong culture that can be a competitive advantage also has a dark side. So what do we do with the dark side, and what are those dark sides, and how do we expose it and mitigate those risks? So those are the types of things we're trying to do from an organizational change perspective, because ultimately that ends up becoming an input into the organizational change plan, which becomes an input into the overall S/4HANA transformation program.
What kind of skills do you need for this change agents? I mean, the formal training on some kind of process or some kind of standard changes, or
Yeah.
Sometimes some of the executives could be influenced, but they can go only so far. I don't need to bring the change.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, we look for the raw skills that you want to see internally. You don't expect that the people on the internal change team have necessarily done change management before, because to your point, we can train on that. There's outside training that can help. But you want to make sure you have the right people that are, respected in the organization and have the right mindset and the right understanding of the business and all that stuff. You identify those people that you feel like would be good at it, then we figure out how we get to train them on being good change agents and, building out their competencies as change people. What we found to work really well for a lot of companies is not to necessarily, in some cases, we don't call them out as the change management team.
Yeah,
we build the change management roles into other roles. So it's almost like it's call it a Trojan horse approach, but it kind of is a Trojan horse. You're not calling it change management. You're not calling it out as this standalone work stream. It's just part of your job is to manage the change, and here's how you're going to do it. And we're going to train you on how to do it or provide the tools to do it. But that's part of a broader role that you have, on the overall project. That works a lot better if you can do that. I mean, for a lot of companies, it works a lot better. And even on our team, like when we're hiring at third stage, I like to hire people that are really good at change, but they can also do like process improvement and other stuff, because then you just weave it together and it's not like a standalone thing that then becomes like another thing you have to do. It just becomes baked into how you operate.
Plus, I think if they see somebody that can help them improve process, they have respect for that person and they're seeing the value add rather than just this esoteric change thing that they're bringing in. I think that's a great idea.
Thank you. I'm full of good ideas.
Ah,
Right. So that's a bit about change management, and then I'm gonna move it along here just in the interest of time, so we can get a break in here before Daryl's session, and then we get into technical readiness. So this is where we start to look at data, architecture, IT skills, technology training. The big thing is how can we build a certain amount of S/4HANA competency internally, and again, just so we can be somewhat at the same level as our SI. We don't have to be as much of an expert, although, like we talked about before, they're going to be learning probably on the job as much as your internal people in a lot of cases. But so how do we use that as an opportunity now to build this competency internally so that we aren't leaning too much on the SI? And then there's also the that center of excellence concept. How do we build an S/4HANA competency longer term, not just to support the project, but post implementation, so that we can do upgrades and continue to improve on our own without having to bring in the SI every time we want to do that.
Is SAP offering any self-paced training on S4, so both technical and business?
I can mention that. So there are some dedicated websites, and in the last 3 years, SAP has been churning out so many YouTube videos, and there are a few YouTube channels. So this actually, I have a list of sources specific to where you can go and get that. First one is you need to know the main websites, like product related, process related. So there is a help.sap.com, which is like a jungle, which you can easily get lost. Number two, there are jam groups, which means like these industry specific people coming together and trying to share ideas, as well as suggesting, hey, this is what we have issues with. And the third one is there is a wiki page for each of these areas. So that is another source list. Then the fourth one is there is a SAP blog, and the website is called blog.sap.com. That is, there are a few active bloggers who keep writing periodic updates. So that's the fourth one. And the fifth one is your local ASUG chapter. The ASUG stands for America SAP User Group. So be part of the ASUG chapter. So these are the places where you can gain educational information, but I would say please restrict yourself going outside of SAP for now, because there are so many people who claim to be experts and throwing out stuff there. So it is sometimes like questionable. Is this person going to lead me through the entire journey, or is he going to stop blogging at some point or posting videos? You never know. So there are I have a list of learning areas I can share with you.
but the one thing I do want to point out, that might work for you guys and maybe your top people that are underneath you. But my experience is that most of the day-to-day people are expecting a classroom type training situation. Only about 25% of people are comfortable with self-learning, self-directed learning.
And it also needs to be specific to them too.
Yes.
Like, I don't care about the
They
generic
are
stuff.
not going to go research.
Yes.
They're going to go skip out the back door. If you guys do that, it's not happening. Very few people have the ability to do that.
Yeah, so as part of the COE, again, one of the initiatives you typically, when you plan a project and establish the COE, the training element is vital for the COE to address these things and get onboard everybody onto the platform that we're getting. So that's a huge topic by itself. And that could be also reading latest industry articles like last Sapphire, what was the technology or the papers or the lessons shared. Plus, just keep on reading and playing with it. And if you have a system access, that's another place. If you have a system to play with, that also helps you to, or your team, because they want to feel like kind of like empowered that I know what I'm doing.
ASUG's a good place to coach people too. If you're looking for a job and you're a technical or functional, whatever, you're gonna be at the local ASAC, so, so it's a good place to find people, or talk to people about other people that they know want to transition.
ASAP is a really good resource. We go and present at ASAP as much as we can, and we get a lot of vendors. It's really, really underutilized.
And it's almost free.
Yeah.
It's like $30.
Well, there are different channels. If you are a company, you have to have a corporate membership. Then if you are an independent person, I think that there are different slabs of how you can sign up. But as soon as companies purchase SAP, immediately they will say, please come and join our team, because we want also, this is a platform where they get lessons learned from customers so that they can further refine and improve the product.
And one other last note on this is that first line, I skipped over the architecture and integration plan. If you are going to have third-party systems, which most of us will, whether it's CRM or MES or HCM or whatever, and even if it's one of SAP's products like SuccessFactors or Ariba, like you mentioned, we have to figure out what is that integration plan long-term, what's the interim integration plan as we're phasing the project. A lot of companies get stuck on that. That ends up derailing stuff when we don't have that well-defined, because that affects everything. I mean, it affects your process definition, your testing, all that stuff.
Everybody's developing in a silo, and then they leave, how do we connect this all together? And when they go to connect it all together, they realize that the way they built it is not going to provide the data flow to be able to do those connections in the way that they had in the big picture thought. Yeah.
I knew you were going to bring it back to data.
And then you have to start all over again.
All about data.
That's just as important as you phase out your project. If you want to start with certain modules or certain business units, the integration points that are existing need to come into your new system, and then you need to kind of enliven them as you pull in more functionalities. You may have one core that has a dozen systems still integrated with it that are more legacy systems for phase one. Phase two takes 2 or 3 of those off the list, and what that roadmap looks like for kind of end-lifing the integrations of some of those systems that are more legacy oriented is important here too. And I think sometimes that's okay. How do we integrate what's going to stay, and how do we integrate what we're getting? But your plan for kind of turn off the lights over here and then over there needs to be incorporated into that as well.
Yeah,
It's not unusual to have to do it twice. Yeah, you have to integrate it 2 times or more.
Yeah,
sadly, before you get rid of it.
Then the last work stream is the project governance and planning. So think of this as more of that program management piece of it. The SI, the technical project manager will fit within this, but this is the overall program. It would include your charter, your internal team, what that's going to look like. It could also include, for a lot of companies, this could be the SI selection, or the resource definition, as far as identifying who those outside resources are going to be. If you haven't already picked an SI, then that would fall within this work stream as well. And then once you've done that, it's then figuring out what is that overall program transformation implementation plan to include, again, the technical work stream with your SI or other technical resources. And then a really important piece that just so many SIs just skip over, don't even really think about, probably because they don't want they do want the fox guarding the hen house, is the risk management and mitigation plan. It should say mitigation, not migration. I think Daryl got a hold of this and put migration. It's all about data.
ETLs.
Yeah. Right. She did a
Like a supplemental.
Yeah, just a little subliminal message about data. So that risk management, most SIs work with, especially the big ones, just are not very good at that. And I think it partly is because you have to be pretty self-aware and be able to call BS on yourself. In their case, you have to be able to say, this is not going well in this area, and we're not doing a good enough job here. Or there's a risk over here that we haven't addressed. So it's almost that's where that third party, the outside perspective, can help. And that's really important because you need to get ahead of those risks. You don't want to wait until by the time you feel it or others on your team feel it, it's too late. It's like the canary in the coal mine. You've got to not wait till the people die. When the canary stops singing, you've got to be ready to mitigate at that point.
They have meetings about how to word or avoid putting items on risk lists and issues lists. They do.
It makes
They
them
have-
look bad if they
Yeah.
do.
They have internal meetings about how they're gonna address or not address things that are, you're not privy to those meetings. And then, so if you put them in charge of that,
Yeah.
it's gonna be pretty short.
So that's what I saw that four in the box, the GE model. Anytime a risk is flagged, I've seen that effective because everybody comes together and say, is it a medium or is it severe risk? Let's collectively agree, and so that you reduce that conflict.
And your project status is never green.
Right.
If you do a project status is green, then you need to question it a lot. Because the day
First
you
week.
go live is the go live date is the day you're actually hitting the business. That's when you can have 3 years of implementation or 2 years of implementation, but the day you go live is the day you're actually seeing how it's going to work. So you need to start measuring from there to probably like another 12 months.
Yeah.
At least a couple of quarters, a couple of month-end close, quarter-end close. To see how things are working.
Right. Yeah. All right. So I'm going to hit one last slide and then we'll take a break, and then I'll hand it to Daryl. This is just a QA framework. It's semi-related, but semi-not related to readiness, but we didn't know where else to fit it, to be honest. The QA piece of it, I know that's a bit hard to read. We'll share the slides. Let's see if I can. Where is it?
Well, it's a lot better than it was yesterday. This thing was really, or maybe because we shut off the lights.
Yeah.
It's easier to read.
That's probably why. So these are just the different lenses. I won't walk through it in detail. I think it's mostly self-explanatory. But these are the different lenses that we'll typically analyze a project in. And this is that framework I was telling you about that we also use for project recoveries or when there's a failure and we've got to figure out how to remediate. These are all the different angles that we analyze a project from. And there's a tool set we use behind each of these boxes here. And it's also the same tools that we use to help Marcus and other attorneys, analyze what went wrong in a lawsuit. And then the best place to use it though is early on in the project and use it throughout to identify those risks and be bringing them up to the surface and figuring out how you're going to mitigate those along the way. So I won't spend a lot of time on it, but it's just a good way to work through it. And I agree with you, Sue John. If you're showing all greens in all these areas, something is not right. You're not doing it right.
Not really fun.
Yeah, and even on day one, usually you start early on. You start to see process alignment, for example, might be yellow on day one because they're not aligned, and you've got to figure out how to address it. And where you are in the project also matters too. On day one, process alignment might be yellow, but if you were within 3 or 6 months of go live, it might be double red because that needs to be addressed pretty early on.
What's the typical frequency?
It's more of usually several checkpoints we'll have throughout that are a formal view of this, but really it's an ongoing thing. As program managers, we're always looking at these things to make sure we've addressed them and having the more formal deep dive and readout, so that you can take to a steering committee. It might be monthly, it might increase as you get closer to go live, and obviously it dovetails into the go, no go decisions and things like that. So I wouldn't say, there are those formal checkpoints like the steering committee, but it should be just constant, baked into your PMO.
Something that's worth addressing on the red, yellow, green status conversation is a cultural thing internally too. I've worked with organizations where if you're not green, if you're yellow, that's not an acceptable status. And then if you are red, you're getting phone calls from the executives, CEOs, EVPs. This is the communication of what those things mean needs to be fairly well managed and clear cut. Like green means that it's a bright sunshiny day and everything's going perfect. And an ERP implementation, those days are few and far between because this is hard work. And yellow is not a bad thing. It just means that we are actively managing to make sure that everything stays on track and there's an active management involved in that. Red means that something is going to be missed, and we're going to work to pull it back to yellow. And the last thing you need to have happen is start telling stories about what's veiling the truth behind a green, because your organization responds a little bit too aggressively to a yellow or a red, and then what happens is you go from green to red, and that's never a good thing, because it's like, well, what in the world happened to yellow? Like, it should be very, very seldom that you go from green to red, and it should never, and even less seldom that's a surprise. So the yellow state needs to be communicated well and accepted as an understanding, at least from a high level understanding perspective, that yellow's not bad, it just means we're paying attention. That's really it. Because to your point, until you validated that you're live, up and running, and have no further operational disruption, your entire project isn't technically considered bright green the whole time.
And then I'm assuming if we've internally sourced our program management, someone like yourselves, you could be an objective external party who's like, you say you're green, but we're here to tell you you're not.
Yeah.
In these specific areas.
Yeah.
That's part of it.
And that's okay. You know, because we have a plan. That's the biggest problem with the status that's a yellow or a red is when you can't answer the question, well, then what are you doing about it?
Yeah.
If you can't answer that question, that's the problem, not the actual technical status and the color, because these things will come and go as different colors, different statuses along the way. You work to piece it back together.
And I'd say, what are you going to do about it? And what are the impacts right now on the future based on where we are?
Yeah.
I think those two questions are really
Always need to have a back to green plan.
Yeah.
We need to be prepared for that.
And as you see a lot of yellow and red, sometimes you have to say, well, we can't put out all these fires overnight. So we've got to prioritize and say, well, here's a real root cause. I mean, this is a higher priority right here. You've got 5 reds, but this one, that's the main one because it's affecting the other reds, or it's at risk of putting other stuff to red or whatever. That's the kind of stuff that.
the kind of like a critical path, critical change.
Yeah.
And again, back to the relationships, would we have SAP or an SI also tell us, let us take care of the QA framework, like we'll let you know. Like, I'm back to the interplay between all the different parties. That's how
Yeah, because they have that, because SAP has, I can't speak as much for the SIs on this, but I know SAP has, what's it called, Max Attention, is that what it's called?
Max Attention, there is a program, yes.
Okay, it's kind of a technical QA, which is focused on, which isn't a bad thing, it's just, it's very technical. Is the software working? Well, that's not, I mean, yeah, that's one box in here, but there's all the other stuff that's not.
That's you just hit on that. They're focused on the technical aspects of it, but as we've outlined here, like it's really more about everything else, and the technical is all around it. So they're focused on that, but not so much on the others. So it's easy for the other things to get out of control, and that's why having people that are focused on things other than that and the overall independence is so valuable. Yeah. I think they do a good job at the technical, particularly SAP.
Yeah.
They'll be all over that. And if you don't like something, you get on the call, they're there. Then the big dogs come on and they're on the call and they're there. And sometimes you get that with an SI, sometimes you don't. But if it's SAP involved, they don't want to fail. They don't.
Yeah. All right. So any questions before we take a quick break here? All right. Sorry, Daryl.
Good session, actually, really helpful.
Yes.
Very, very helpful.
I'm glad we took the time with that one. I think it was worth it.
Me too. I'm glad. I was thought about trying to cram it into the yesterday.
Oh.
And you got some of the change management in there.
Yeah.
So this is really important.
Yeah, and yours and Daryl's will be probably similarly insightful, and the discussion. You typically generate a lot of discussion in that session. So we'll take a.
He's setting you up.
Let's take a 12-minute break. We'll start at 20 after.
Okay.
And then we'll get into Daryl's, and then we'll close out with Marcus. So we'll put you on mute here for those of you on the
Scaling up.
call. We'll be right back with you.